Powerful, it pulled you straight out of bed before your mama even called your name. The kind of breakfast that did not come from a box, a drive-through, or a trending recipe online. It came from a woman who knew how to turn almost nothing into everything. These breakfasts did not just feed bodies, they built people. They built whole generations. And somewhere between convenience food and modern brunch culture, we lost them. Every single one. Hi, my name is Patrick, and this is Soul Foods Rewind. Fried cornmeal mush was the breakfast that refused to waste a single thing. It started the night before, when a pot of cornmeal porridge was cooked, salted, and left to cool in a pan until it set firm and solid by morning. Come sunrise, a black mother would slice that cold mush, thick as a Bible, and lay each piece into a skillet of hot grease until the outside turned golden and crackling, and the inside stayed soft and warm as a whispered prayer. Served with a drizzle of cane syrup or a spoonful of molasses, it was sweet and savory at the same time, filling enough to carry a child through a long walk to school and a man through hours of field labor before the sun reached its peak. This wasn't fancy food. Nobody was putting this on a menu, but fried cornmeal mush was morning in a skillet. Thrift, love, and yesterday's effort made new again. 2. Hot water, cornbread with cane syrup. Now, if you know, you know. And if you don't know, sit down, because we are about to change your life. Hot water cornbread was made from exactly 3 things: cornmeal, salt, and boiling water, stirred together until the batter was thick enough to pat into little rounds with your bare hands. Those rounds went straight into a cast iron skillet of hot oil and fried until the edges turned deep, golden, and crispy, while the center stayed soft and tender. The sound of it frying was its own kind of music. When you drizzled warm cane syrup over the top, something almost sacred happened in that kitchen. Children grabbed them straight from the pan, burning their fingers and not caring one bit. This was not a recipe that lived in cookbooks. It lived in muscle memory, in the hands of grandmothers who never once measured a single ingredient and still got it right every time. 3. Salmon croquettes with grits. Canned salmon was not glamorous, but in the hands of a black mother who knew what she was doing, that humble tin became something that made the whole house smell like victory. Salmon croquettes, some folks called them salmon patties, and I will not argue with either side, were made by mixing canned salmon with diced onion, cornmeal, a touch of flour and egg, then shaping the mixture into flat rounds and frying them until the outside was crispy and golden, and the inside stayed moist and flavorful. Paired with a bowl of creamy, slow-cooked grits, this was a breakfast plate that carried real weight. It was protein. It was warmth. It was the kind of meal that made you feel like the day was already going your way before you even stepped outside. Saturday mornings in black households across the South smelled like this dish. I will go ahead and say it. No brunch restaurant has ever beaten it. 4. Crackling cornbread and buttermilk. Cracklings were the crispy golden bits left behind after pork fat was rendered down for lard. Now somebody who didn't know any better might have tossed those scraps aside. Black cooks looked at those cracklings and saw treasure. They folded them right into cornmeal batter with buttermilk, salt, and just enough flour to hold everything together. Then they baked it in a screaming hot cast iron skillet until the bottom was dark and crunchy and the inside was rich and dense, with little bursts of pork fat throughout. For breakfast, families broke off pieces of crackling cornbread and dunked them straight into cold glasses of buttermilk. The sharp tang of the buttermilk against the salty, smoky cornbread created something no 5-star chef has ever been able to recreate. Because you cannot recreate necessity seasoned with love. This was a breakfast born from a slaughter day tradition, and it tasted every bit as special as it sounds. 5. Pork liver and onions over rice. I already know what some of you are thinking. Stay with me. Pork liver was one of the most affordable cuts of meat available to black families in the rural South, and a skilled cook knew exactly how to tame its bold, iron-rich flavor into something magnificent. The liver was sliced thin, seasoned, and dredged lightly in flour before being laid into a hot skillet with a generous pile of sliced onions. The onions cooked down slow and sweet, while the liver browned and developed a deep, savory crust on the outside. Served over a bed of white rice that soaked up every drop of the pan drippings, this was a breakfast that put iron in your blood and starch in your spine before you even walked out the door. Families who grew up eating pork liver and onions over rice never forgot the smell of it. It was one of those dishes that announced itself from 3 rooms away, in the best possible way. 6. Sweet potato biscuits. Sweet potato biscuits were what happened when the garden and the pantry decided to work together and produce something extraordinary. Leftover roasted or boiled sweet potato was mashed smooth and folded into biscuit dough made from flour, lard, and a touch of buttermilk. The sweet potato gave the dough a warm orange color and a natural sweetness that made these biscuits unlike anything plain flour alone could produce. They baked up tender and soft, with a slight crumb that pulled apart beautifully. Eaten warm with a pat of butter or a ribbon of sorghum syrup, sweet potato biscuits were a breakfast treat that doubled as celebration food. Proof that even the simplest garden vegetable could become something worthy of a Sunday morning table. Black families across the Carolinas and Georgia made these regularly during sweet potato season. Today, they have nearly disappeared, and that is a loss that deserves to be named out loud. 7. Field pea cakes. Field pea cakes were born from the no-waste philosophy that governed every black kitchen worth its salt. And I mean that literally and figuratively. Leftover field peas from the night before were mashed together with cornmeal, diced onion, a pinch of salt, and whatever seasoning the pantry offered, then shaped into flat patties and fried in a skillet of hot grease until each cake developed a crunchy, golden crust on both sides. The inside stayed soft and earthy, tasting of the land itself. These cakes were hearty enough to replace any meat at the breakfast table, and filling enough to hold a working man through hours of hard labor without complaint. Children ate them plain or alongside a fried egg if the henhouse cooperated. Field pea cakes were frugality turned into something genuinely delicious. A breakfast that proved yesterday's supper could become this morning's gift without losing a single drop of dignity. 8. Chicken neck gravy over biscuits. Here is a truth that a lot of the people need to hear. The neck of a chicken is one of the most flavorful parts of the entire bird. Black cooks knew this long before anyone else was paying attention. Chicken necks were simmered slowly in water with onion and seasoning until the broth turned rich and golden, and the small bits of meat slipped free from the bone. That broth was then thickened with flour and drippings into a gravy so deeply flavored it could make a grown person close their eyes on the first sip. Poured over fresh-baked biscuits that soaked up every drop like they were born to do it, chicken neck gravy was a breakfast that stretched one modest bird into a meal that felt like abundance. In households where nothing was wasted and everything was honored, this dish was routine. Today, it is nearly gone from our tables, and we are poorer for it. 9. Dandelion green hash. Every spring, dandelion plants pushed up through the earth in vacant lots, along fence lines and at the edges of fields, and black families, particularly in the rural South, knew exactly what to do with them. Young dandelion greens were gathered fresh, washed carefully, and sautéed in a hot skillet with sliced onions and bacon fat until the greens wilted and the onions turned sweet and golden. Diced potatoes or a fried egg were added when available turning the hash into something substantial enough to call a real meal. The greens were slightly bitter, the onions sweet, and the fat tied everything together into a plate that delivered vitamins and warmth in equal measure. Children might have wrinkled their noses at the bitterness, but they ate it because their mothers and grandmothers knew that the land provided freely if you were willing to pay attention and get your hands in the soil. Dandelion green hash was foraging turned into breakfast art. 10. Grease gravy rice. When breakfast meat finished frying in the skillet, lesser cooks let the leftover drippings sit cold in the pan. But black mothers looked at those drippings and saw the beginning of another meal entirely. A spoonful of flour went into the hot grease, sizzling and popping until it turned deep golden and nutty. Then milk or water was poured in slow and steady, stirred constantly until the mixture thickened into a smooth, creamy gravy that smelled of smoke and salt and something almost indescribable. That gravy went over white rice in deep bowls, coating every grain until the whole thing gleamed, salty and rich and smoky all at once. Parents called it breakfast. Children called it their favorite. Neither one of them fully understood that it was born from rationing and making do, because it tasted too good for anyone to think of it as poverty food. Grease gravy rice was survival that forgot to taste like struggle. 11. Sorghum syrup biscuits with cold milk. Sorghum syrup was a sweetener that sugar could not afford to be for most black families in the early 20th century. It came in wide-mouthed jars that seemed to last forever, dark and thick, carrying a flavor deeper and more complex than any refined sugar could manage. Biscuits were made from flour and lard, baked until golden and soft, then split open and drizzled generously with sorghum while they were still steaming from the oven. A cold glass of fresh milk was poured alongside. That combination of warm bread, dark syrup, and cold milk was a breakfast that stopped time for a moment. Simple enough to make on the worst week the pantry had ever seen, but special enough to feel like something worth sitting down for. Sorghum syrup biscuits with cold milk reminded families across the South that sweetness did not require wealth. It only required patience and a good hot oven. 12. Ash cake bread. Ash cake bread is one of those dishes that makes you stop and reconsider everything you think you know about what a kitchen has to be. It required no oven, no pan, and no special equipment whatsoever. It was made from cornmeal, salt, and water, pressed together by hand into flat rounds of dough, and then buried directly into the hot ashes of a wood fireplace or an open fire pit. The outside of the bread hardened into a smoky, dark crust, while the inside baked slowly into something soft, golden, and warm. When it was done, families brushed away the ash, broke it open, and drizzled it with molasses or syrup. It tasted earthy and sweet at the same time, carrying the faint smoke of the fire in every bite. Ash cake bread was made by enslaved people, by sharecroppers, by families who had almost nothing but a fire and the knowledge passed down through generations of hands that refused to let hunger have the final word. 13. Hominy crackle porridge. Hominy, dried corn kernels treated with lye until they swelled and softened, was a staple in black households long before grits became fashionable. When leftover hominy sat cold from the night before, it was stirred into a pot of water or thin milk the next morning, sweetened with molasses, and spiced with nutmeg or cinnamon if the tin held any. The pot was stirred slow and steady over low heat until the mixture thickened into a porridge that crackled and hissed against the side of the pan. The smell was earthy and warm and sweet all at once, something between cornmeal and wood smoke and in morning itself. Children sat with chipped bowls in their laps, waiting for the first ladle. The porridge was thick, creamy, and deeply filling, carrying enough energy to push a child through a full day of school and chores without complaint. Hominy crackle porridge was humble in every ingredient and extraordinary in every bite. 14. Fish roe and onions. Communities that lived close to rivers, bayous, and coastlines across the South had access to something that city grocers rarely sold and fancy restaurants never advertised. Fresh fish roe. The egg sacs from catfish, perch, or whatever the river offered up were cleaned, seasoned with salt and pepper, and pan-fried in lard or butter alongside a pile of sliced onions, until the roe was firm and golden, and the onions had gone soft and sweet, caramelized at the edges. Eaten hot with a piece of cornbread or a plain biscuit on the side, fish roe and onions was a breakfast full of protein and flavor that cost almost nothing if you caught the fish yourself. It was not a dish that showed up on anybody's trend list. It was a dish that showed up at the table when the river was generous and the cook was ready. That's a kind of abundance that money alone cannot manufacture. 15. Pumpkin cornbread pancakes. In the fall, when garden pumpkins were harvested and stored in root cellars and cool corners of the house, they became part of nearly every meal on the table, including breakfast. Pumpkin puree was stirred into a cornmeal batter alongside flour, lard, a touch of cinnamon, and buttermilk, then ladled onto a hot cast iron griddle and cooked until the edges set and the tops bubbled. The pancakes that came off that griddle were tender and slightly sweet, golden orange in color, and carried the warm spice of autumn in every bite. Drizzled with sorghum syrup or eaten plain with butter, pumpkin cornbread pancakes were the kind of seasonal breakfast that tied a family to the harvest and to the land that fed them. They were filling without being heavy, sweet without being indulgent, and completely unforgettable for anyone who grew up with them on their Saturday morning plate. 16. Soot biscuits. Soot biscuits sound like something a person would politely decline at a dinner party, and that is exactly the kind of thinking that erased history. These biscuits were baked directly inside soot-covered Dutch ovens set into hot coals, a technique used by families traveling, farming, or simply living in homes where a proper oven was not guaranteed. The outsides of the biscuits came out dark and charred from the coals, but when you brushed the ash away and split them open, the inside was soft, steaming, and tender with a faint smoky sweetness that no conventional oven could ever produce. Eaten with syrup, molasses, or a spoonful of gravy, soot biscuits were bread born from fire and patience. They carried the smell of smoke in your hands and your clothes long after breakfast was done. And for the families who made them regularly, that smell meant safety. It meant morning. It meant someone had stayed up long enough to tend the fire so everyone else could eat. 17. Hogshead hash. When a hog was butchered, nothing, and I mean absolutely nothing, was considered waste in a black household. The head of the animal provided meat that was cleaned, boiled until tender, then shredded fine and mixed with diced potatoes, onions, and peppers before everything went back into a hot skillet together. The hash was pressed and stirred until the potatoes browned and the meat crisped at the edges, and the whole skillet smelled of smoke and seasoning, and something deep and satisfying that you felt more than tasted. It was a breakfast built entirely from parts that others dismissed, and it was extraordinary. Strong enough in flavor to wake up the most tired body, filling enough to carry a person through the hardest morning of work they had ever faced. Hogshead hash was not just resourcefulness. It was a declaration, a statement that nothing given freely by the land or the animal would ever be thrown away by the hands that worked hardest for it. 18. Wild berry dumplings. In the early mornings of summer, children across the rural South were sent out to gather wild berries, blackberries, blueberries, mulberries from the patches that grew along fence lines and forest edges. They came back with stained fingers and full baskets. And their grandmothers turned those berries into one of the most beloved breakfast dishes that have ever been forgotten. The berries were simmered into a sweet, tangy syrup in a deep pot, and then simple dumplings made from flour, water, and a pinch of salt were dropped in by the spoonful. The dumplings puffed and swelled as they cooked, soaking up the berry flavor until each one was soft and purple-tinged and bursting with sweetness. Served hot in wide bowls, sometimes with a thin pour of milk across the top, wild berry dumplings were a breakfast that tasted like summer itself, free, abundant, and earned with morning effort and purple-stained hands that never once complained about the work. 19. Fried green tomatoes with grits. Before the end of the growing season, when the first chill moved through the air and unripe tomatoes still clung to garden vines, Black cooks made a decision that turned potential waste into something legendary. Those firm green tomatoes were sliced thick, dredged in seasoned cornmeal, and fried in a hot skillet of oil or bacon fat until each slice developed a golden, crackling crust on the outside, while the inside stayed tart and tender. Alongside a bowl of creamy, slow-stirred grits that took up every ounce of the tomato's sharp flavor, this breakfast was a masterpiece of contrast. Crunchy against smooth, tangy against mild, bright against rich. My grandmother served this on weekday mornings without any ceremony, as though it were the most ordinary thing in the world. It was not. It was one of the finest plates of food I have ever put in my mouth, and I will stand on that statement without apology. 20. Eggshell pudding. Now I know this one is going to raise some eyebrows, but stay with me because this is exactly the kind of story that Soul Foods Rewind was made to tell. When eggs were scarce and families had used every last one, the shells were not thrown away. They were washed thoroughly, dried, and ground into a fine powder that carried calcium and minerals the body desperately needed during lean times. That powder was stirred into a mixture of milk, cornstarch, and sugar, and cooked slowly over the stove until it thickened into a pale, smooth pudding that was served warm in small bowls, sometimes with a drop of vanilla if the family was lucky enough to have it. Children thought it was magic, and honestly, it kind of was. Eggshell pudding was the breakfast dessert that came from nothing, from the very last thing most people would have thought to save, and it fed people anyway. That is not poverty. That is genius. 21. Okra fritters with corn silk. Here is something that will genuinely surprise you. When summer corn was shucked and the silky threads pulled free from the ears, most people treated them as trash. Black cooks treated them as an ingredient. Those fine golden threads were gathered, shredded, and mixed into a batter of chopped fresh okra, flour, and a splash of milk or water, then dropped by the spoonful into hot oil, where they puffed and crackled and turned golden at the edges. The corn silk gave the fritters a delicate, slightly sweet texture that complemented the okra's earthiness in a way that felt almost accidental, but was entirely intentional. Served with a drizzle of syrup or a splash of vinegar depending on what the family preferred, these fritters were crispy on the outside, tender in the middle, and unlike anything a person could find in any restaurant in 1960 or today. They were poverty's poetry, as I like to say, fried into something absolutely worth remembering. 22. Cornmeal dumplings and tomato broth. This one came from my grandmother's kitchen specifically, and I am not sure I have ever fully recovered from how good it was. The broth started with canned or fresh tomatoes cooked down with onions, garlic, and whatever seasoning the pantry could offer, salt, black pepper, and a bay leaf if one survived the week. Into that bubbling, tangy broth went small dumplings made from cornmeal, a little flour, salt, and water, dropped in carefully by hand and left to simmer until they swelled and softened and soaked up the tomato flavor all the way through. The smell alone was enough to pull the entire household to the kitchen without a single word being spoken. It was hearty without meat, filling without excess. A breakfast that cost almost nothing and delivered everything a body needed to face the morning. Cornmeal dumplings in tomato broth proved that two of the humblest ingredients on the shelf could produce a meal worth passing down through every single generation that followed. 23. Red gravy with rice. Red gravy with rice was a breakfast tradition so rooted in Southern Black food culture that it appeared on weekday tables with the same regularity as sunrise itself. Tomatoes, fresh from the garden in summer, canned when the season passed, were cooked down with onions, a touch of garlic, and seasoning until they thickened into a savory, slightly sweet gravy that shimmered with color in the pot. That gravy went over white rice in deep bowls, coating every grain until the whole plate glowed warm red and smelled of the garden and the stove at the same time. It was filling, it was affordable, and it was deeply comforting in the particular way that only breakfast food can be comforting, the kind that makes the day feel manageable before it has even properly begun. Red gravy with rice was the breakfast of workers and dreamers and survivors. It was never fancy. It was always enough. 24. Leftover grit cakes. If you have never had leftover grit cakes, I genuinely feel something for you right now. When the morning grits were done and the pot was scraped, whatever remained was poured into a flat pan and left to cool until it set firm and sliceable overnight. Come the next morning, those cold grits were cut into thick slabs and laid into a skillet of hot bacon grease, where they fried until the outside developed a golden, crackling crust, and the inside stayed soft, creamy, and warm. Served with eggs, syrup, or simply on their own, grit cakes were thrift elevated into tradition. They were the proof that a careful cook never let yesterday go to waste, that every pot had a second life waiting inside it. Children who grew up on leftover grit cakes did not think of them as leftovers. They thought of them as the best part of the week. And they were absolutely right to think so. 25. Molasses coffee. We saved something special for the end, and I want you to sit with this one for a moment. When real coffee was too expensive and sugar was completely out of reach, someone brilliant and unnamed discovered that a spoonful of blackstrap molasses stirred into hot water or a weak brew of whatever grain could be roasted made a drink that was dark, thick, smoky, and sweet in a way that felt almost luxurious against the reality of the morning. Molasses coffee tasted like work and resilience, like fields at sunrise, like factory bells, and everything that made a black family's morning both hard and holy at the same time. Some families added milk when fortune allowed. Others took it plain, with a crust of bread held in one hand and the day held in the other. It was courage in a cup. Strength stirred up from the simplest thing the pantry had left, and it sent people out into the world every single morning ready, not because life was easy, but because the cup in their hand proved that it was still possible to make something warm and good out of almost nothing at all.